afternoon and welcome to this meeting of the Public Administration Constitutional Affairs Committee. Today we're holding our fourth and final evidence session into our inquiry into membership of the House of Lords, and we'll be reflecting on the evidence that we've heard so far with representations from the political groupings within the House of Lords. We want to explore things like the appointment system, size and membership of the Chamber, its role and its relationship with the House of Commons. Our witnesses this afternoon spread across two panels. First, we'll be hearing from Baroness Smith of Basildon, the Shadow Leader of the House of Lords, and the Earl of Kinnoull, of the Convenor Crossbench Peers, before moving on to Lord True from the Government. So, good afternoon. Perhaps you could introduce yourselves to the record, starting with Baroness Smith.
Yeah. Angela Smith, Labour Leader of the House of Lords, Shadow Leader of the House.
And Charles Kinnoull, I'm a crossbench peer and was elected as convener in April last year.
Welcome, and we're very grateful to have your time this afternoon. So perhaps I could start with really a kind of just the opening question, which is, what you consider to be the role or roles of the House of Lords. Clearly, we've been through quite a journey over the last century in terms of its role and composition. But perhaps starting with you, Baroness Smith, because a large chunk of where we've got to now perhaps happened under the period of the last government, with rather more incremental change since. Roles and responsibilities from your perspective now?
Yeah, I think the main role is one of scrutiny and revision, a scrutiny and revision chamber. We're an unelected house, well, that obviously puts limits on what we can do and should do. And I think it's quite interesting because most of the criticism about the House of Lords comes from things that we have little control over, like the membership and appointments. But in terms of the work we do, I think there's some pride in that. In that we do have the opportunity and the time to really get a sort of deep dive, particularly into legislation, scrutinise legislation, suggest amendments to the House of Commons. At the end of the day, the House of Commons has the final say as the elected House. But I think there's a usefulness in having the time to explore a different way of doing things, and if there are more amendments than could be looked at. So it's a secondary chamber, and I hope it could be. And perhaps we could do it better sometimes, and perhaps the relationship to two houses could do it well. It should be useful to Parliament as a whole, rather than trying to take a leading role. And
you have, of course, served in the House of Commons as well as the House of Lords. And I think you're right to emphasise the House of Commons will always be the primary chamber. But in terms of its revision and scrutiny role, do you think its composition and its ultimately its lack of legitimacy in terms of direct election, is that a hindrance or a help in terms of that scrutiny?
I suppose it's where you're looking at it. In some ways it's a help to the House of Commons because we do not have the legitimacy of an elected House. And if you look at ping-pongs on bills, there is always a point at which the House of Lords will say that the House of Commons has spoken, got to take a step back. So in that case, it's quite helpful to the House of Commons, I think, that it isn't elected. On the other hand, it can be quite frustrating for a second chamber that if it wants to press things further. I feel very strongly about the primacy of the Commons, perhaps because I've come from the Commons. I've actually just turned the point where I've been longer in the House of Lords than I was in the House of Commons. I think there's a matter of months in it. But the primacy of the House of Commons is very important to me, and I think there are times when the House of Lords has to say, we've made our point, we've made suggestions, we feel strongly. I do think, though, we talk about the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and sometimes the government confuses what is the role of the House of Commons and what is the role of the government.
Yes.
And I can think of examples on legislation where they say, you're challenging the House of Commons. No, we're sending something back to the House of Commons, but the government often will say, if it's got a large enough majority, we are not accepting any amendments to this bill. And I think that's a bad starting point for any minister to say that my bill is perfect the first time it comes out. So it needs to be in two directions. The House of Lords has to know when it's appropriate to pass amendments and when it's appropriate to stop pushing the issue. But there has to be an acceptance from the government that the House of Commons has the right to consider the amendments and give some thought to amendments that are sent to it from the House of Lords.
That's really a challenge for the executive, though, isn't it?
I think it is.
And it, to what extent do you think that attitude on the part of the executive is not just related to the House of Lords, but perhaps...
That's probably more of a question for people around this table than me. But I can think of an example recently on the Rwanda bill, where on one particular issue about the Afghan interpreters, for example, where most people felt they should be exempt from the Rwanda legislations, whatever your views, even if you were supporting it, most people felt that was a sensible amendment to the bill. And we had more ping-pong votes on that than any other issue. But at one point, and I did have people saying to me, we'd rather be voting with you, but no, we're voting with our party. But we did have approaches from the government that they would accept that amendment or something similar. And we said we're very happy with that, but that was stopped by the executive. So ministers wanted to see a change and the executive didn't. But then later on, it was accepted by the executive as well as ministers. So I think sometimes that it's not just about the House of Commons, it's the House of Lords, it's the executive recognising that ministers who are dealing with legislation have a right to take views across both houses and across Parliament as a whole. And that can be a challenge from the executive, particularly if they don't want any amendments to a bill. But I come from the starting point that it's very rare that any piece of legislation is going to be perfect on its first draft.
And that's the purpose of parliamentary scrutiny.
Yes, exactly, in both houses.
Indeed. And another question. I mean, one of the things that, personally I feel very strongly about is, the following of herds that can happen when it comes to the following of herds that can happen in terms of electoral politics. And to what extent do you think the House of Lords can act as a brake on that? I ask that question because really over the last decade we've seen a lot more polarisation in terms of how we conduct our debate. And to what extent does the non-elected nature of the House of Lords give it a degree of objectivity in terms of that scrutiny?
Look, I wouldn't say because we're not elected we don't have our moments when it can be a bit tense. But my sense of being in both houses that you can get cooperation between across the House. Partly we have a significant group. The second largest group in the House of Lords are the crossbenchers, the independents. And then you've got others who this new criteria we have, which is slightly strange, which is the non-aligned, of which even, and I think Boris Johnson appointed non-aligned peers, not crossbenchers, which is a strange concept, and that's relatively new. You've got the bishops, you've got smaller parties. So you have, no party has ever had a majority. The government often says we haven't got a majority in the House of Lords, so we're the biggest party. It's about 50% of the political grouping. With the largest party, we haven't got a majority. No party, no government has ever had, since I think 1945, a majority in the House of Lords. But it can be more deliberative. I think the House of Lords works better when it doesn't try and replicate the House of Commons and say we're going to put lots of people in to get our legislation through, as we've seen more recently, but it says we've got a deliberative approach to this so we can have a discussion about it. That's when it does its best work, that's most useful in looking at whether the legislation is fit for purpose.
Lord Kinnoull, how do you see the role of the House of Lords?
I should say that I agree with everything that Baroness Smith has just said.
That doesn't always happen.
Yeah, but I think that I just to put it in this, I'm looking at the thing from a slightly different angle. I mean, the British Constitution is a three-legged stool. One of the legs is Parliament, and the leg is split between the Commons and the Lords, and we both do the same things, which are look at primary legislation and carry out the scrutiny of the government. And in the primary legislation side, and the Lords is pretty busy. I mean, in the last session, according to my numbers, there were 7,500 amendments considered, of which 2,500 became part of bills. And so the chambers, and both chambers are used for this, are very active and sit late into the night regularly, looking line by line at legislation. And it's something which institutionally we're quite tuned up to, so that individual members well understand the meaning of words and we joke about it. The other bit is the scrutiny bit, and we're divided there between sort of on-the-floor scrutiny, like during question time, and the House of Lords committees. And our committees are set up, as you know, differently from yours. You face the ministries and we face themes. And I think that's actually, for the whole of Parliament, quite a useful structure all round. And I was chair of the European Union committees before taking up this role. And we looked at masses of different ministries during the Brexit period and looking at things in great detail. And of course we had to publish unanimous reports. Every report of all of the committees, 7 committees throughout the Brexit period was unanimous, and of course all the committees included people with very different views about the Brexit thing. So we are trying as a House in a particular style to produce useful scrutiny as well through the committee system.
And of course the contrast with the House of Commons, of course we are extremely partisan. I mean, what role do you think particularly the crossbench peers add to this in the House of Lords?
Well, I think the first thing we should remember, of course, is that the writ doesn't run very strong for party-aligned peers in the House of Lords because there's nowhere for them to go, really. So you get a lot of disobedience among that. And so in many ways, emotionally, there's a lot of crossbenchers even on Angela's benches. But the crossbench is trying to produce people who are genuine experts in particular things. So we have quite a lot of scientists, we obviously have a lot of lawyers, we have the military men as well, just as some examples. But in trying to produce that type of expertise and trying to have people who genuinely are looking at things in an independent way, we think we can assist the House, or the idea is we can assist the House in reaching difficult decisions on hard matters.
And, do you think, in the 21st century Britain, is it appropriate really for a non-elected House to be playing such a significant part in our parliamentary system?
Well, I strongly believe in a second chamber. I do feel that it doesn't matter whether you look within these shores and lack of second chamber problems in Edinburgh, or whether you look further these shores at other countries. I think a second chamber with these revising powers and with the absolute well set up system to provide the revising, I've tried to put some numbers on that. I think that's a very good thing. The question comes as to what type of chamber you'd like. The difficulty with an elected chamber is that then there would be a question about the supremacy of the House of Commons. And so I think the imperfections that we have generated, I'm sure we're going to come on to discuss a few of those, are ones which are well worth the price because we get a highly effective revising chamber. And I really believe that both the committee work and the legislative work is very valuable within the Lords and is looked at in other jurisdictions with some envy.
Baroness Smith, how do you feel about the continual role of an unelected chamber in our Parliament?
It's quite interesting. I was listening to Charles was speaking. He talked about the revising powers. My concern on elected House is I'm not saying I'm against elected. My concern about managing it is how you don't give powers or greater legitimacy to a second chamber and lose the primacy of the Commons. So I think that's one of the sort of contentions there, how you do that, whether you could do it if you had a fully elected House. I'm uncomfortable with a House that would be hybrid. I think all members in the House should be equal. But if you have an elected House, how do you ensure the House doesn't, in a sense, try to say we've got an equal mandate to the Commons? So I think that's the challenge. But I think the way in which peers are appointed is pretty opaque to most people, pretty opaque. I have no idea how crossbench peers are appointed at all. Charles Hoyt mentioned this earlier. And I just think as things change, there's different ways of doing this. And I know there are some who want an elected House and some want a fully appointed House. Whatever way, how you embed and find a way to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, so you get that deep dive into legislation with a specific role for a second chamber, but don't lose the primacy of the Commons. I think that's the challenge, how you, if you're going forward on reform, how you marry those up.
That's why it always gets parked.
Well, I was on the committee that looked at removing hereditary peers all those years ago, not long after I came into Parliament, and that was one of the big issues constantly being discussed at the time, and that's why we have this ridiculous situation now of the by-elections for hereditary peers. If one falls off their perch, another one can be elected to take their place, which gives an imbalance in numbers as well when you add appointments into that. And that was because I think the bandwidth, how long you could spend talking about House of Lords reform, exhausted people. And so you got a partial reform, which everyone says put it off to later. some of the things sound easy but can then become more complicated. So I think my advice would be to really, if you're embarking on that major reform, know where your end point is,
Yes.
or have a rough idea of the parameters for your end point when embarking on it.
Thank you. MacDonald.
I have an end point, but we can discuss it another time.
Sorry?
I have an end point, but we can discuss it another time. And it would be the end. Anyway, how do you describe the relationship between the Lords and the Commons? Do you think the members of the Lords understand how the Commons works, and do you think members of the Commons understand how the Lords work?
I'm probably in a different position because
Yeah.
I've done both houses, and I think there is a lack of understanding which doesn't help. I've had MPs say it's outrageous that the Lords voted for an amendment. You're trying to wreck our bill. Being accused of wrecking a bill is a common one. We do not have the power to wreck legislation. So that's a common misunderstanding. I think there's also a tendency within the Commons to think of the Lords as being about numbers. Now, I hadn't been leader of the Labour group for long in the House of Lords when the Brexit debate was on, and Jacob Rees-Mogg said the government was going to appoint 1,000 extra peers to get its legislation through. Didn't realise I introduced 2 a day, so it had taken some time to get to the point of having a majority. So I think that's a misunderstanding about the role. I think the role that sometimes peers don't understand about MPs is the other pressures on MPs. We make a great play that we focus on legislation, how much we do. That is what we do. That's the day job and the evening job. Whereas as an MP, the other pressures as an advocate for your constituency, your constituent work and all those which feed into your parliamentary work, but that's another role you have that peers don't have. So I think when we have joint committees before legislation, I think that works really well because then you get a different perspective bringing to legislation. So I think there's more we could do on that one. There's certain things I wish I'd known as a new MP about the House of Lords, that some of the reports the House of Lords produces would have been really useful in looking at legislation, particularly secondary legislation. So I think, if we're going to do government well, the Lords can only be good at scrutiny if the other side wants to hear what they have to say. Otherwise, it's just an exercise that's no great value. So I think if we can sort of say, look, the Lords isn't about numbers, it's about looking at some of the detail that could be useful to us, that builds a better relationship. But when peers and MPs work together, there's normally a better outcome.
How would you describe the relationship at the moment?
It depends on the issue, to be honest. And I think it's not a bad relationship. The relationship with the government is more difficult because the government often wants to equate the Commons with the government. Jacob Rees-Mogg said about 1,000 new peers. Michael Gove said he wanted to send the Lords to York, which I thought quite an interesting concept when you've got 2 Houses of Parliament looking at legislation and ministers answering questions. So I think it's better with MPs than it is with the government.
Some people would like to send Mr. Gove somewhere else as well, but Charles.
Thank you very much. I think that the relationship is slightly asymmetric, and we have the advantage in the Lords of having quite a lot of ex-MPs around. Yeah. And they, of course, inform us about the Commons quite successfully. And that's on top of things like the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, the Council of Europe thing, the Interparliamentary Forum, the joint committees and things where we actually intermingle with each other. But by definition, it doesn't go the other way around because you don't have a lot of ex-peers running around. So I think that in preparing for this, I was reflecting on the asymmetry of the knowledge of each other. And sometimes our processes are probably a little bit strange to you. And just as Angela was saying just now, that you think, gosh, that's a wrecking amendment. And all we're thinking is it's something logical because we spent 4 hours debating it. And it's a very strange thing. But it's certainly something which I think should be worked at because now that, as it were, I've had a sort of, thanks to this session, time to think about it, I feel that something should be done.
To add to that, John, it's also, we have no selection of amendments when we're doing legislation, and we don't select the committees that are looking at legislation. Yeah. So that means anyone who's got an interest can participate, and they're on the floor of the House mainly. And I think that creates a different way of doing the things. So just to add to the comments Charles made about the differences.
Different stages, particularly in this session, we've sent down to you huge amounts of amendments, some of which have been introduced quite late into the Commons itself. have we in the Commons become over-dependent upon you scrutinising that legislation?
I think we're doing more of the heavy lifting of legislation, which I think is unfortunate because I think we both benefit when we both do it. The Public Order Bill was an example where the amendments were put into the at the House of Lords that hadn't even been considered by the House of Commons. And I don't think ministers realised initially that if they were voted down in the House of Lords, they couldn't come back to the Commons in the procedures for them. So I think that's unfortunate. But yeah, I think that's happening a little bit more often. I did a TV programme with a Conservative MP, and she was complaining that we were taking too long on legislation. And she said, well, what you take 3 days to do, or somewhere, we do in an afternoon. I think that says as much about the House of Commons as it does about the House of Lords, actually, which is unfortunate.
Charles?
It's slightly an area, of course, Erskine May patrols, but all I can say is it wouldn't matter what state you sent us the legislation in, the Lords will perform its function. It's sort of, it will. But certainly, I think that some of the things, and Angela's has given a very good example, we are scratching our heads a bit because the issues that have come down are things that we know are ones that are of great interest to all politicians of whatever party in whatever legislature. But it's not for us to worry about your processes. I think we're trying to worry about ours.
Whether we're becoming over-reliant upon you.
And I think that Erskine May would suggest that I shouldn't answer that question.
If a bill comes to us that the Commons hasn't spent very long debating, and I was once told by a minister that we shouldn't pass any amendments to this because the Commons hadn't, it does give some people an excuse to speak longer and spend more time on it than needed. If there's a balance between both houses and the time we're spending on legislation, that seems reasonable. But if there hasn't been much time spent on legislation, then there will be peers who say, well, the Commons hasn't looked at it, we need to go through it in even more detail, and that can give an unbalance in the time that's spent.
You have no caps or guillotines?
No caps or guillotines.
Just as a follow-on to that, though, I mean, there's legislation, isn't there? I mean, do you perceive that this issue of legislation not being fit for purpose, requiring more amendment, has become more acute over time, or is it a function of how political the issue is and the extent to which it's a reaction to current events? What do you think the dynamics are behind that?
I don't think there's ever been a time when legislation presented to Parliament has been perfect the first time. I think the government's attitude to whether or not something should be amended has become less prepared to look at amendments. A recent minister said to me a while ago, because I did Home Office brief in my early days in the Lords, and I remember afterwards we would talk to the minister and perhaps have a drink afterwards and say, well, what about this? We put forward that. What was your answer? And sometimes they would take it away and they'd come back and say, look, we can't do this, but we've been talking to Secretary of State, and they'll have a suggestion. And they'll quite often bring forward an amendment of their own that sought to address some of the concerns raised. And the minister said to me, not that long ago, it's not like the old days, we're not allowed to do that now. So I think there's less willingness to accept amendments. And I think, it's not some sort of wrestling match where one side's going to win. You want to get good legislation. Yeah. And the Lords will always look at the workability. There's big political points. We all know there's legislation, Rwanda being one, but there's a big political principle, a fundamental disagreement. But there's also, within that, and a lot of legislation, where you're talking about the workability, having good legislation, doing it well, and that's a different order where there should be much more discussion about just getting things right.
I'm going to make a very small point on top of that, and that is that it might be helpful to the figures that I gave you are figures that would be possible to find out in terms of number of amendments considered and number of amendments that were then passed. And the only other figures that I had are ones that are left over from a presentation to school children that I used to give, going around in the piers in the schools, from earlier sessions, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And that number has definitely increased, and I think you might be able to look at that and see that over time the number of amendments being considered and the number of amendments being accepted both of those would have gone up, and that might be an indicator of the point you are making.
How effective is the House of Lords at its current size, Baroness Smith?
It's a difficult one. My own view is the House of Lords is too big. And I think part of that is how appointments have been made alongside the hereditary by-elections and the appointment of ministers on top of that. So when Labour left office after 12 years of a Labour government, we had 24 more peers than the Conservatives. After 14 years of a Conservative government, the Conservatives have over 100 more peers than Labour. And that is a huge difference. And part of it is accelerated appointment system. Part of it is on hereditary by-elections, new people come into those by-elections, but the parties also want to appoint new people to come in. So you've got a double appointments on the two groups that have the most hereditary peers. We've also seen a lot more of ministers being appointed. Since I've been leader, which was 2015, I think there's something like 27 or 28 ministers who have been appointed new to come in as ministers. Some of them haven't been ministers very long. Some of them we don't see anymore, but they're still members of the House of Lords. There's also the House of Lords brought in the ability to retire. When I first went in, you couldn't retire. You were stuck there. Whether you wanted to be there or not, you could not retire. Now you can retire, but I think it's not in the consciousness of a number of people. And in my own group, because we haven't had as many appointments, I've said to people, well, look, if you turn up a couple of days a week, that's more than if you're not here at all. So it has got bigger. In some ways, the active membership is a bit bigger, not so much bigger on my side because the active membership, but I think the way you'd look at this is what is the numbers required to fulfil the functions? And at some point you have to have both looking at the entrance and the exit to say how do we get to a better number of peers that fulfil the job that needs to be done. But on paper I have 172 colleagues on the Labour benches. Probably about 130 plus is the number that will be there available to vote and come in regularly. The Conservative benches have 277, but still having trouble getting the legislation through because people don't turn up. So I think you could have a sort of more active. I would never say that everybody has to be there all day, every day. Some people come in for their expertise, and we benefit from that. But I think the imbalance in numbers makes it more difficult, and I'd say it's too big at the moment.
Well, of course, we looked at this as a house with the Burns report in 2017, and in fact you wrote a very good report. David Jones on the committee then, a very good report very shortly after that, and so and we all it was a unanimous vote that we felt we were too big and we should reduce the size, and the Burns committee has carried on reporting in order to sort of mark the card, as it were, see what's going on, and I have detected nobody on any benches anywhere in the House who doesn't feel like that.
It's the first time in history that the House of Lords has voted for reform and the government said no.
Very good point.
What, if any, cap should there be on the House of Lords?
It's hard to know. I think you'd have to work out the committees and that. There's talk about and suggestions it shouldn't be larger in the House of Commons, which doesn't seem unreasonable. Whether it would be 500, 600, 400, to be honest, I haven't got a figure in mind. But I think it's a band, because you wouldn't have an absolute cap, because I think you need to provide the role for refreshing people leaving. So probably around or a bit smaller than the size of the House of Commons, probably. But I think you have to do a proper bit of analysis to say what's a fair number.
And I think that you can have a conventional cap, but the trouble is that the Prime Minister has 3 weapons available in order to whip the House of Lords in, which are the Salisbury Convention, the Parliament Acts, and the ability to create masses of peers. And I don't think any Prime Minister would want to give up that third weapon. So you're left with that. But I do think you could have a conventional cap, which only in special circumstances could be breached, and to bring it down and that then everyone would agree, well, that's enough, and the Lords should function with that number.
Ronnie?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And Baroness, you said there in your answer that you thought the House of Lords was too big, but you've also said, presuming there's going to be, I agree with you, there's going to be a Labour government on the horizon, that you need to refresh your numbers in the House of Lords. Now, if refresh your numbers presumably means increase your numbers. So you're not just going to add to the situation here?
I don't see any room for having a massive increase in the number of Labour peers. We do have to, every party wants to refresh its numbers. But if I tell you that in the last list of new peers that came in, there were 4 Labour peers. I think there were 8 government peers, and there's been 2 new ministers since then as well. And we have actually lost, I think, since I first heard new ones were coming in, about 7 who have left the House of Lords. So it's not just about who comes in, it's who goes out as well. I would like to see, I don't want to see a House of Lords much bigger than it is now. I'd like to see, my ideal, if I'm talking about ideal, and getting from A to B isn't always easy, roughly the same numbers between government and a major opposition party, roughly equal numbers. Because I don't want it just to be about numbers, and it's not the House of Commons. We shouldn't try and replicate the House of Commons and say, we've got more people, we'll win this. It doesn't work for the government. They would not have lost all those votes from Rwanda if Tory peers had turned up, because they didn't like it, didn't turn up. So I think there has to be a plan over time to get the numbers down a bit, but also a mechanism of which you can refresh numbers to replace people to get new expertise and new experience coming in. But it's been put to me time and time again that a Labour government would appoint hundreds of new peers. I can tell you Labour government will not appoint hundreds of new peers.
John Stevenson, say.
You made a very interesting point about appointment of ministers, who then subsequently have nothing to do with the House of Lords. Is there an argument to suggest that you could have a situation where you appoint people who are ministers as temporary peers, who then perform their role as a minister and then may or may not continue as an actual voting member of the House?
Yeah, I think they may or may not. They keep the peerage for life. Yes. But the membership of the House of Lords, yeah, I think there's a case for that. I don't think there's anything wrong in wanting to bring in expertise for somebody who can do a role as a minister. I think it is difficult to walk straight into Parliament and be a minister, because the thing that terrified me most when I first spoke at Dispatch Box in the House of Lords, and bear in mind I'd been Minister in the House of Commons as well, was that whatever issue you speak on, there are lots of people who know far more about it than you do. And that can be a bit daunting at times. But I think there is an opportunity to say this is a temporary position, possibly. You could say, depending on the length of time somebody's a minister, because somebody might be a minister for a long time and really embedded in the work of the House or really engaged. You've got to be a little bit careful, because you could find somebody being appointed to a job as minister, sacked the next week, but they've made a commitment, but their government hasn't. But I think it's worth looking at and worth exploring, is what I'd say to that.
Idris and Lyle.
Very much. Look, you mentioned that at the Burns Committee, and it recommended, of course, to reduce the size. One of the options that would be non-legislative could be an agreement with the party leaders in the House of Lords to cull some of their own. I'm not sure that's the words they used, but that's effectively what it said. Has there been any move in the party leaderships in the House of Lords identifying or finding a way that you could fairly identify without it being momentarily partisan within the party? If the cull had happened under Boris, it might be a very different cull than under Rishi. Kind of how you would identify that. Has there been any work on that so far?
I think that if you mean, is there a particular work stream to do a particular thing to aim it down at particularly to the 600? Remember, the Burns Committee has a structure in it, yes, where we're on a glide path. And speaking from our own grouping, we are conscious of that, and we are trying to explain to people whose career within the Lords has sort of finished, and you are there. And this is from my writ of summons. You're there to be personally present with us and give your counsel upon the affairs. And the thing is that if you're not able to do that for whatever reason, then we're encouraging people to move down. I should say the average age of the House of Lords is currently 71, and the average age of the Crossbench is 73. There is, you can see that there are going to be some people who've got to the point where they wish to step back from the front line.
There's no formal agreement, or then there's no process of working out a joint agreement between the parties.
I'm sure as in your house, and I'll hand over to Angela in a second, there's constant discussion among us all as a sort of usual channel type arrangement. And certainly I keep Angela and her colleagues fully apprised of what I'm doing, as I do the other groupings, in an effort to try and make sure that we have people who are willing to contribute to the work of the House turning up.
Yeah, there's no all-party agreement. You'd have to get all-party agreement that the House was too large, and unless you've got that, you wouldn't be able to move forward. The Burns Committee, I think, is quite good at outlining what it would look like, and they talk about 2 out, 1 in. Mm-hmm. Another method I think Professor Meg Russell looks at is if you took 3 elections and said what's the relative strength of political parties over 3 elections in the House of Commons, how would that be reflected in House of Lords membership? Because you wouldn't have the highs and lows, you'd have a sort of more evened out.
Burns suggests that as well, with this going forward, you have a third appointed on 15-year terms, always according to the result of the last general election on a kind of party list style kind of thing.
Yeah. But there's no formal discussions taking place. I think within groups, you do talk to your colleagues to say, retirement is open. And I think sometimes we do a disservice to some of our colleagues because somebody falls ill and you don't ever say, there's not a formal retirement process where they can make a valedictory speech, but you don't say, yes, thank you for your work, make it, as if you were retiring from a workplace. They sort of carry on until they can no longer do it. And given I've got over 100 fewer than the Conservative Party, I've not been too keen to see people leave.
Is there a problem that you can't reappoint when people leave?
Oh.
And if there was a system of saying, OK, there are 2 out, but I know that I will be able to then appoint 1 in, you could refresh within your numbers, but at the moment you don't know whether you'll get the 1 in or when that will come around.
Absolutely.
You could reappoint.
Pardon?
You can reappoint. You'd have to make someone appear all over again.
Yes, but you may do so at the invitation of the Prime Minister to make appointments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the governing party, that's not a problem for, but for the opposition party, there's not a motivation to give up a number of seats because you don't know when your next appointment slot will come, and that will be proportional to what the Prime Minister is currently appointing, not reflect on how many you might have then resigned.
Yeah, I touched on that in my early answer, really, that I have a number of colleagues who have said, look, who would have been quite happy to retire, but they weren't seeing that they would be replaced by somebody who would be more able to do the job than they are, do more than they can. So there has been a reluctance to retire if all you're doing is removing one of your number. That's a fair comment.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you much. Do you think there should be a mandatory retirement age for members of the House of Lords?
There's different views on it, and I work with Alf Dubbs, who is at 91, is pretty amazing and still taking active part in debate. And it's quite hard to say, well, actually, you'd have said to him if it was, say, 11 years ago, bye, Alf, thank you, if you could go. It is open to members to retire, but not as many choose it. I think my generation of members will, because it's been there most of my time in the Lords. But if you came in 20 years ago and it wasn't in your conscience then you were going to retire, you're less likely to. But it's in most places of work there's a mandatory retirement age. It's quite a difficult one to work through, but I think those are the kind of discussions we have to have in terms of if you're going to refresh numbers. It's got to be about how you make appointments and how people leave. So I think that's the kind of discussions that have to be had now.
Thank you. Cool.
I noticed that, I note that in the 1980s a retirement age was imposed on the judiciary, and that applied to all new appointments, but the existing appointments, Lord Denning and people, could carry on and they did. But actually some of them didn't, that they then respected the retirement age and did it. And I think that myself, the way to do it, because actually, particularly on the crossbench, we have some highly effective people like Alf Dubs on your benches who are above any likely mandatory retirement age, and yet they are really good. So I would be in favour of putting something in for new members.
I think I disagree with that. Just because I think you've got to have all members on the same basis in a body. So if you might have, you can't have a different retirement age for those that are there and those that aren't. So, but I think these are the things that the Lord's going to have to grapple with. And I think if I've got to have a retirement age, or you can have a length of service, and there's one of those things will have to come into play at some point.
I mean, presumably, age is no factor when you look at effectiveness of a lord or lady. When you just mentioned Lord Dubs there, or their attendance. That, you know, is it the fact that, you know, some of these people are very committed and still coming in, and some people who've maybe not been there as long decide not to come in?
I think participation is a big issue, and more than attendance, because I think, you know, people can come in, but if they're people there and participating, they're playing a role, and their colleagues know it and they're welcomed. And that, you know, is another factor in looking at the size of the house. If you look at how many, not everybody who's a member of the House of Lords participates, and the rules make it difficult for some people to retire. So I think that has to be examined as well. And there's also a quite, I think, slightly ridiculous point about leave of absence, where some people go on perpetual leave of absence and renew it regularly. Some because they are doing valuable work outside the house and they'll come back and they'll contribute. Some because they'll come back if they can't find anything better to do. And I think that's an abuse of the leave of absence system.
Yeah. I'd agree with the leave of absence system points completely, and I do feel that we need to look at that, and that's something the Lords, I think, can look at on our own. Perhaps I'll just leave it there because I know time is short.
My apologies, Ronnie, I should have come to you earlier.
That's okay, Chair. Just slight step backwards. I'm a little bit conflicted here, Baroness, because you mentioned earlier on that you didn't think there would be a huge influx of Labour peers after the general election. But 2 or 3 times you've mentioned the fact that you're 100 down. So the number's obviously something playing in your mind. And you said in your article in the Politics Home, there'll be something about House of Lords reform in the manifesto. It is most times. But I think we should be honest about what we can achieve and what we're ready to do. You know, it's that last phrase that got me, what we're ready to do. Could you enlarge on that?
Not particularly. What's playing on my mind is the appointment system, I think, has been galloping along without any constraint, and that's why there's 100 difference. And I don't think, and I think I said also, I prefer to see roughly equal numbers between government and opposition parties, and it's been more about a deliberative process than who's got the most people there to win a vote. That's how I think the House of Lords should operate. Do I think we should appoint 100 to bring us up to the same number as the Conservatives? No, I don't, and that is not where I'm heading. But I think I've said it 2 or 3 times now, the process has to be looking at how people come in and how people leave. And I think it has to be a balance between those, so you do have a transition period where you get to a better level of membership in the House. How that's to be achieved is, you know, open discussion, and some of the things you may have to wait to see a Labour Party manifesto at the time of the next election to get a more detailed answer.
I'm still confused by this phrase, what we're ready to do. Who's we?
We would be what the Labour Party would be ready to do. I suppose there's 2 we's there. What the Labour Party would be ready to do and would be in the manifesto, and there'd be a timeline there, so that's what's ready to do. But also the House of Lords can do some things without needing legislation. I think the House of Lords as itself would like to do that. So there's 2 things. So the House of Lords has on many occasions voted to end the hereditary peers by-elections. That would have meant, had they not been in place, that over time the number of hereditary peers would have fallen. And I think there's, what's the total number of hereditary peers now? 92, isn't
91.
it? 91. And there's 2 that well. So that would have been a reduction over time if the House of Lords has had its way. So I think the House of Lords has to look at what it can do, and the government of the day should look at what the government should do.
Jones.
Yes. Baroness Smith, do you believe that there should be a limit on the term that a member may serve in the House of Lords, and if so, what do you think that should be?
Yeah, I'm not immediately attracted, I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but I'm not immediately attracted to the terms, and various numbers have been suggested. I saw one figure of 7 years, I think Burns says 15 years. But I also accept that to be in a position for life is also a rather odd concept if people don't take opportunities of retirement. So my concerns about a fixed term is some people might say, 15 years, if I go, that's my last 15 years of employment, I might think it's sort of a retirement post. But it also might put off younger people who would say, well, actually, I'll be 60 at the end of that. What do I do then? What's my employment prospects? So I think you have to look at the case on their merit. But I'm not immediately attracted. I've been in the Lords now just over, I came in 2010. So coming up for 15 years. So I should be off if it was a 15-year term. One of the roles of the Lords that's not looked at so much but plays into us a lot on legislation is the role of the Constitution. I think it sounds rather pompous to say you're custodians of the Constitution, to be honest, but I think it does play into Lords' consideration of legislation more so than perhaps in the Commons. I've been in Parliament 25 years, I'm still getting to grips with that. So I think it's quite hard sometimes to fulfil the role if you know there's an end. So I'm not against it, but I think I'd like to see if that was being put forward as a proposal, I'd like to see some discussions on what the level would be and what the expectations would be of members in that time. Because if you're talking about, say, 7-year term, 10-year term, 15-year term, is it a full-time paid post during that time, or is it on the same basis as now? So I think it alters the role significantly. So I think that would have to be worked out of how that would be managed. It would give you more certainty on refreshing numbers.
Lord Kinnoull.
Thank you. I think the thing I would like to hear discussed, which is not the same as saying that I'm wholly behind this and I think it's my position, as it were, is a 15 years with an additional 10 years available for people. Because, in fact, if you were to look at the sort of management tier of the House of Lords, you'd find that everyone is either at or close to the 15 years, and that people are in their peak in many ways. So I'd say 15 plus 10 plus something to deal with people who happen to join the Lords age 68 and as well. So it's more complicated than that. And I think that if there was a proper proposal that could be discussed in a white paper in some way, that would be an interesting thing to discuss versus today's forever.
And we've touched on that you've mentioned there are 91 hereditary peers. Should hereditary peers continue to have a place in the House of Lords, Lord Kinnoull?
Also, I have a conflict here because I am a hereditary peer, so I'm probably not a good person to answer it. But the clue for me is that peers are peers, as it were, and whatever the route was you came in, people are working in the same committed way to try and do a role for the same financial arrangements and with the same pass and in every way the same. And I think it's quite hard not to recognise that, because there are some other funnies as well. There are obviously the bishops, and there are a few law lords who came in through a strange process as well. So I think I do believe that the time has come to end the elections, and I think this is quite likely to feature in Angela's manifesto that she can't talk about. But and I think that that will happen. But more radical approaches than that would be likely to take quite a long time, I would have thought.
Could I explore that a bit more? You've said you think that the time has come to end elections.
Yes.
So presumably you think that the Lords should be open to hereditary peers, but that they should arrive there by more orthodox routes than simply being born to go there.
Yes, it seems rather odd that someone's born in some way with two parents or something and they have to go through a different door. It doesn't seem right.
Baroness Smith, what are your views on that?
I have to say, I think it's hard to justify taking a place in legislature on the basis of who your parents, grandparents, etc. were, if you look back. But I think the current appointment system needs as well. So I'm not saying I'm not going to sort of just pass comment on the hereditary peers. I think the appointment system needs changing as well. When Charles says that it's time to come to end the hereditary by-elections, the time for that was a long, long time ago. And I think it's a real shame the government hasn't accepted sort of the offer to get, the Lords voted for it. I don't think you've had any problems in the House of Commons voting to end the by-elections. They're only supposed to be temporary. They should have been finished a long time ago. What I would say is when you're working the Lords, you don't know who the hereditary peers are. And this is the point I made earlier about having a hybrid membership. I feel slightly uncomfortable with hybrid membership. I think people outside the House are more conscious of it. We don't know who they are most of the times. So, but I don't think it's a great route. It's also causing an imbalance in the House, in that the two groups that have the most hereditary peers have also had their numbers refreshed, but in a double whammy in two ways. So that's why the numbers are so much greater. So it's actually meant that they've replaced the hereditary peers, often with people who are much younger, but they've also had appointments as well. So I just think the whole issue of the appointments has to be looked at.
If you think that hereditary peers should end...
I didn't say that. I said it's a hard thing to justify.
Or are you seeking to justify it?
I'm not seeking to justify, no.
So I'm assuming from that you don't justify it. But that being the case, and if I, as I infer, you're saying that the hereditary principle should end and that hereditary peers should be brought to an end, do you think that they should be brought to an end immediately, or do you think simply the elections should be brought to an end?
I've still got an open mind on that. I haven't reached a final conclusion on that myself yet.
Thank you.
You want to come in, John? No. Lloyd?
I'm a little... I mean, I understand some of the caginess, and it's perfectly understandable at this particular time in the cycle. I'm a little confused, however. We say that the Burns Committee has produced something that was unanimously agreed. Yeah?
Yeah, I think the principles...
that was the detail of the Burns Committee is 15-year terms. It is the ending of the hereditary peers, elections, and a phasing out of them. It is 1/3 elected. It's still crossbench. It's a 7-year terms for judges because they'll have already been a judge, and it talks about proportionality according to the parties over a 3-year cycle, effectively. So what I'm a bit confused about is that in one sense we say we all support Burns, and then when we've asked on any of the specific issues, both of you, Crossbench and Labour, and I understand the caginess from a party that's about to go into government because we've got to still work out our policies, but are kind of saying, oh, well, I'm still considering, still contemplating. Is it that you agree with the principle, but every time in practice you're like, well, actually, I still want a lot more thinking about this to delay it in the long grass?
Actually, I didn't say what you say. I said about, I didn't say about Burns. I didn't comment on Burns particularly. I think most people, when they look at Burns, and the discussion we've had about Burns, is pretty much look at the principles. You've got to find a way of doing this better and reduce the size of the House. And I think that's the principle that everybody would agree with. When you get into detail, there's different views on detail. It's going to be sometimes 2 people and 3 opinions on it. That has, I think, in the past made it difficult to get to reform, but I think we have to get over that and come up with concrete proposals to do so.
Well, I mean, Burns has come up with concrete proposals to do so.
Yeah, and not everybody agrees with all the details.
And not everyone agrees with it, but it's
a basis.
Are we going to get caught up on not everyone agreeing with every single point, or that we swallow the bigger bitter pill and we say Burns is what we're all going to get behind?
One of the most important details, and that is there are 3 unfairnesses around with the hereditaries, the bishops, but the biggest unfairness is the unlimited power of the Prime Minister to appoint peers. And so the Burns thing is a deal which includes that detail. And so I agree with Angela. The Burns was a thing where we said we would like some change. We would like to reduce the size of the House. We want to cater for some of the difficulties you have of people not turning up, and we would like to do all of that. This is a very sensible proposition, but the Prime Minister will have to put his piece on the table as well. That's the
it
sort
has
of,
to be a package.
It must be a package. You couldn't reform two things and not the third.
So the second thing of that list is about the continuation of the Lords Spiritual. We've heard evidence that the Lords Spiritual themselves have offered potential of reducing in half their numbers, or that they could do a rotation system over a longer period of time. Do you think that's a feasible option, or is it just an option that we need to move away from the Lord Spiritual entirely?
It's news to me and I haven't really thought about it, so I'm not sure I would give you a sensible answer.
I've spoken to some of them. If the size of the house reduces and the size of the Lord Spiritual reduce at the same time, rather than moving faith, I'd like to see more balance of faith across the house. We used to have the chief rabbi in the house. So I think if you've got a faith representative, it should be faiths that are represented rather than just faith.
Is there a problem with faiths represented, seeing the Catholic Church bans people ordained sitting in legislatures, and of course you then have questions about which denominations you're recognising or which not? Do you recognise humanists as part of that faith family or not faith family? Is it not better to just kind of say there should be a role for them to apply via the crossbenches or via the Independent Appointment Commission, and the Appointment Commission should consider these things, but there shouldn't be a hard and fixed rule on it?
There's lots of ways of looking at it. My sense is there are lots of people of faith in both houses. They're not necessarily representing their faith, but they bring their faith with them that informs their political views and their views on issues, which I'm entirely comfortable with. I think if you've got looking at people, you look at the contribution they can make to the work of the House rather than just what faith they come from. So for me, the bottom line of any appointment should be what's the contribution people can make. As I said, I think, the bishops, there's certain things that I have had my own expectations of the House of Lords confounded on. One was that all crossbenchers were Tory, which I found that because if you're a political animal, you find it hard that people are genuinely independent. And I find, the crossbenchers are mostly genuinely independent of political views, and it depends on the issues for them. And I assumed that most of the bishops would be rather Tory. And they're not. Again, they're pretty independent. They don't all take part.
We think they're all Labour.
Well, it's funny, there's a debate that took place where a Conservative peer had a real go at the crossbenchers, saying the reason the government had to have lots more appointments because all the crossbenchers were Labour. And we're thinking, hang on. So, it's perspective you're taking it from. But I think, I'm not going to get into disestablishing the Church of England, but I think there's a role for faith in politics, but it's also a role for not having faith in politics as well.
I would only add there that the Church of England also, of course, brings so much about the schools that they run, and so they have an extra case over and above some other faiths. I just add that for completeness. But I agree with that, and I think HOLAC is a good organisation that has a great track record, and I think that it could expand itself and go into the faith business and advise a future house about such things if it chose to.
Go into the faith business more widely, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? Thank you very much.
John, you want to come in?
Just on the hereditaries, I can't help this, but the expression that was used, that it's hard to justify. The reality is there is no justification, is there, for people being appointed on the basis of who their mum and dad were? Is there? Justify it.
I don't think so. But if you're born as a hereditary, you're in that. Nobody who was born made all these rules up. But
there's no justification for them being appointed on the basis of them being there on the basis of who their mum and dad was or who their great granny slept with years ago.
Not in the modern world. No.
No. Good.
We don't run any of our life like that now.
Good. Just for the record.
I wonder, before we move on, I should have declared an interest earlier on. I do apologise, but I chair the Council for Arab-British Understanding, which has actually made a submission on this point, although I have not played any part in that submission myself.
Thank you, David. Tom Randall.
Thank you, Chair. You touched on your last answer, Lord Kinnoull, on HOLAC. So if I could ask some questions about the House of Lords Appointment Commission specifically. And perhaps starting with you, do you think HOLAC is carrying out its role effectively?
I do. It's got two roles, of course. The first role is to find crossbench peers who are going to be working peers, and over its life it's found just over 70 of those, and I reviewed the list in preparing for today, and of course they are stars. I mean, it's done really well at finding very effective people who are well regarded by the House. Its other role is to look at the propriety of people in general, and to advise on that. And I believe in that role it's done a good job.
I think HOLAC may be quite frustrated by its role sometimes, because it can look at the propriety of some appointments but not others. So for hereditary peers coming in, for example, and there is no role on the bishops coming in, there's no role on political appointments, it's limited. Having said that, I'm not 100% signed up to a fully statutory basis, but I'd like to see a lot more transparency in what HOLAC are doing, and I think also what the expectations of HOLAC are. I think the Prime Minister could make that clearer. You know, there has to be the role for the Prime Minister to make the appointments they want, but when a Prime Minister overrules HOLAC, I think that's quite a difficult area to get into, because they have looked at evidence and said this isn't a suitable person, and the Prime Minister at the moment can say yes they are. Now, you get into how's HOLAC constituted, you get into a number of areas there, but I think you can do some work with HOLAC to strengthen its role, to look at some wider issues around appointments.
I mean, just on that, I was going to ask you at the end, but perhaps there's a good point to ask you, is HOLAC's recently announced that it will be asking political parties to provide additional information and assurances about its nominees to the House of Lords before carrying out vetting. Is that something that political leaders in the Lords are happy with, that sort of change? I
think it's perfectly reasonable. Yeah, I think if you get an OBE or an MBE, when it's announced, it says the name and why they've got it. If someone's given a peerage, their name appears on a list from Downing Street. There's no information. And I think that adds to this sort of opaqueness of it. So I think if HOLAC were to be clear, political parties should do their own due diligence before putting names forward. But if HOLAC were to say, we want to look at these issues, I don't think that's an unhelpful way forward.
And you've touched on there the power of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has substantial powers over the appointments process, both in terms of number of peerages created and who's nominated. Do you think it's appropriate that those powers rest with the Prime Minister?
I think you have to give the Prime Minister the right to appoint who they want to. Where I think I've got the biggest issues are, one, there is no constraint on how many at all. So David Cameron appointed more peers, life peers, than any other Prime Minister since 1945. I think subsequently he's been looked like an amateur, if you look at some of the other appointments that have been made. So they've galloped along in terms of the number of appointments. Now, when I say that we've got 100 fewer, more than 100 fewer than the Conservatives, why in the last list were there 8 Conservative appointments and new ministers come in and 4 Labour peers? Because I could actually do with some refreshments to help populate committees and things. So it's done on the basis of, will we get our legislation through? And I'm sure, you know, if governments feel they're losing votes, they then think, oh, we've got to put more peers in the House of Commons so we can win a vote. It doesn't work that way. If that was the case, you know, you wouldn't have the defeats we had when so many Conservative peers didn't vote on particular issues. So I wouldn't completely fetter the Prime Minister on that, but I think just the complete freedom to do what you want doesn't get the best of the House of Lords at all.
I think in no other Western liberal democracy is there an example of such a power. It's a very, very substantial power indeed. And I don't feel comfortable with the size of that power. I described it as an unfairness earlier on, and I do feel that it needs some work to reduce it. But equally, I said the Prime Minister or the government has 3 weapons with which to control the Lords, and it mustn't be under-weaponised, because it does have to be able to. Elected government has to be able to get its legislation through.
So just add to that, I don't think Prime Ministers should really be appointing non-aligned peers or crossbench peers unless they can make a strong justification for doing so. There may be cases where they want to, but I think you've got to give a proper justification for it.
finally from me, Baroness Smith, in your answer, you touched on whether you're sort of open-minded about putting HOLAC on a statutory footing. I just wondered if you had any views on that, looking about the statute in terms of the basis on which HOLAC should be founded.
I'm so sorry. I'm not attracted by trying to put it on a statutory basis. The troubles that I see with doing that, quite apart from the fact it will take a very long time to debate exactly what it looks like, is that HOLAC would become likely extremely powerful. And then you have the question, well, who's going to look at HOLAC and who's going to hold it to account? And so I would prefer to have HOLAC beefed up, but in some more formal way that steps short of a statutory basis. And it occurred to me that one such way might be to have a resolution of both houses or something, setting out what HOLAC's duties in life are again. I mean, HOLAC was born in 2000, so it's a high time for a bit of a rethink for it, although, as I said, I believe it's performed its two functions very well.
So if we're going to reform HOLAC, should they be involved in the appointment of peers by the Prime Minister at any level whatsoever? I mean, we've all heard, the stats tell us that 1 in 5 peers appointed in the last 10 years have donated to political parties. That's 68 out of 284. And in total, they've donated over £58 million. So obviously there's questions there, are people buying themselves a position in the House of Lords? Is that a situation where HOLAC would be wanted to get involved? Was that a vetting process?
I'm not a political party, so I'm not in receipt of any of that money, and I couldn't really comment.
You said you wanted to reform HOLAC. I'm just
yes,
asking,
absolutely.
is this a HOLAC?
But I think HOLAC is looking at proprietary already, and if someone has donated money, I would have thought that is something that needs to...
Would you like to give the teeth to say to any Prime Minister of any political party, you cannot appoint that person because that person donated £20 million to your party? £10 million, £5 million, whatever the duration would be.
Well, as I said, I think these are matters for my beefed up HOLAC. They're not matters that, as I said, what you do with HOLAC from here is still being debated. But as I said, I would like it to have expanded powers. I would like it to look at suitability for MPs. I know that is possibly a minority view. Suitability for new peers, which it doesn't do at the moment, and I would like it to be on a basis which is steps short of a statutory basis, but has a fresh layer of formality to it.
I understand we're expecting votes in Lords very shortly, so I think we need to wire things up. But just very quickly, Barrister.
I don't think being a donor should be a qualification for membership of the House of Lords. I think it's a difference between people who are members who put into the raffle and give £10 a month or something. I'm very relaxed about those kind of £100, whatever. But when you're talking into sort of the big money donors, that is not a qualification for membership, no.
So should HOLAC or position within
whether it's HOLAC or whether it's the leaders of the political parties, I don't know, just it shouldn't happen. So maybe I think HOLAC already do ask for information on donors. And what I don't know, and I don't know enough about this, partly why I'm hesitating, is if they then feed back to say this is unsuitable. But I would have thought if someone is a significant donor, they should be saying to the nominating party that it's not significant. Unless they've got other qualifications. There's somebody who's done a fantastic job, they're a philanthropist, they've got qualifications that's useful, but if the reason they're being put into the House of Lords is because they're a donor, then I think it's just unacceptable.
Yeah. That you'd expect that's part of HOLAC's role, but it necessarily happens in a discreet way. But John,
well, they have to declare it.
Yeah,
exactly.
HOLAC, is there a danger that you just perpetuate an elite by the appointment process?
Clearly there would be a danger, and if HOLAC got it wrong, it would be doing that. But actually, I mean, if you have some knowledge of the types of people within the pool of potential talent that HOLAC has, and it's terrific. It's very, very diverse indeed, and it's not at all. And HOLAC is only trying to put people into the crossbench, of course. So I think from the narrow issue of HOLAC's role in providing 70 crossbench peers in its 24 years, I think it's alert to that issue. And
Not a danger though. You could end up, a GP wants to be up here, or an eminent surgeon wants to appear. HOLAC's more likely to go with the eminent surgeon than the GP.
I don't know whether that's true. I've no idea, but I do believe that HOLAC is alert to such potential problems.
Thank you.
Wait.
You both talked about not wanting to. Baroness Smith talked about not wanting to fetter the power of the Prime Minister. Lord Kinnoull, you've talked about needing to do that.
Overly fetter.
Overly fetter. Yeah. And you talked about needing to reform that. The Prime Minister is using the prerogative powers to do this. But in many other appointments, they need to be passed by the House of Commons. And sometimes those appointments are usually nodded through in the House of Commons. But when they are controversial, it does allow moments for, say, if HOLAC advice hadn't been followed, for the Commons, which is fundamentally giving the majority to the Prime Minister, to put the brakes on it, or to at least raise concerns. Is there an argument for resolutions of appointment to the House of Lords, which would also mean that it's clearly subordinate to the House of Commons, to be approved by the House of Commons en bloc, like we do with other appointments? Or would that be too much of a fettering of the Prime Minister's prerogative, bearing in mind they still have the majority in the Commons in most cases?
Question for me or the Prime Minister?
But would that be a good compromise to provide a check against the Prime Minister's power, but not to remove their power completely?
You do away with HOLAC and you have a House of Commons committee instead.
Well, you can still have HOLAC. What I mean is when the Prime Minister appoints, so the HOLAC process is done, then it needs to be approved by a resolution of the Commons, just like when the commissioners are appointed for regulatory bodies, they need to be approved by a resolution of the Commons. And so a resolution of the Commons could say, well, you ignored HOLAC, so we're not going to grant this resolution, for example.
I didn't observe, and then trying to find the balance between what Angela was saying, with the necessity of the Prime Minister being able to retain the weapon I was describing, and the desire of the House to go Burns, as it were, in trying to find that balance. If you introduce a whole procedure that could throw up some difficulties and things, that might be something that a Prime Minister wasn't so keen on. And for me, the bigger win is getting the size of the House down and beefing HOLAC up a bit. And I don't think it would be possible to have that on top of that.
Yeah, I think a real robust HOLAC procedure where the Prime Minister can't overrule HOLAC would be better.
Can't overrule HOLAC.
If the Prime Minister wants to overrule HOLAC, there would have to be very clear. I'm deeply uncomfortable. I'm trying to think of circumstances where it could be.
I was still thinking of circumstances where the Prime Minister would overrule her. So you're saying that there should be some, and the only way surely to do that is a statutory underpinning, because unless there's a statutory underpinning, the Prime Minister has the absolute prerogative to overrule HOLAC.
Yeah, but you might be able to deal with it by transparency. I'm unattracted to having go through HOLAC and then go through another Commons hearing. It doesn't, or a Lord's hearing. It's a double process. Whether you'd make the HOLAC process a bit more robust or transparency.
Would you allow HOLAC to call it in, to send it to someone else?
It's worth looking at. But I think the first stage, we send it back to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister thinks that's an appropriate appointment, wants to justify it, then they would have to do so. And sometimes,
And that needs to be in public, that communication.
I'm not sure the whole publication initially, because if you're going to reject somebody, there may be reasons why legally that couldn't be made completely public. But I think I'd like to see a little bit more transparency. And I just think, I'm trying to think of circumstances when it's appropriate for a Prime Minister to overrule HOLAC, and I'm struggling to find a circumstance where that would be appropriate.
It is worth noting it's happened once.
Yeah.
By one individual. So.
Possibly twice, but definitely once, yeah.
I mean, it all comes down to behaviour at the end of the day, doesn't it?
One of your...
Okay. Has any colleague got any other questions? No. Any further points you'd like to make? Yeah.
I think so. I think you've been
quite
a run around the issues.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's been incredibly useful for us, and it does illustrate actually that once you start grappling with these problems, the solutions aren't straightforward. But thank you for your very thoughtful contributions. And if there's anything you want to follow up on in writing, by all means do so. We'd be very keen to hear more from you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now have a brief suspension as we move panels. So, order.
Currently suspended. The proceeding is 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 currently suspended.
We now move on to the second panel of today's session, where we are joined by the Right Honourable Lord Truseeby, Lord Privy Seal and Leader of the House of Lords. So, good afternoon, Lord Truseeby. Perhaps you could introduce yourself for the record.
Yes, of course. My name's Nicholas True. As you say, I'm Lord Privy Seal and Leader of the House of Lords. The only thing I would say in preface is it's an interesting role, which I take both sides seriously. One is that I'm the leader of the Conservative Party in the House of Lords and I have a job to do for the government. The other is I'm leader of the House of Lords and I have a job to do for the whole House, and sometimes that leads to different paths of reflection. But I will be glad to assist you wherever way I can.
Thank you very much indeed. So, opening question from me. Ministers have stated that House of Lords reform is not a priority in this Parliament. Perhaps you could tell us why not?
I think that if you join this Parliament, we're getting quite late in this Parliament. Would be the preamble. I think that I've spent a lot of my time campaigning in elections, paradoxically, and I don't think it's the greatest priority of the public to see radical constitutional change. I believe that all political parties should be giving priority to address other questions, and I think at the moment the balance between the House of Lords and the House of Commons operates reasonably well, and I don't think it's a priority to change it.
Of course, we have actually had some pretty robust constitutional change in this Parliament. And, you know, in the past, the House of Lords has tended to be more of a focus for discussion, but I guess we've moved on to other things. Do you think that's a function of the fact that the Lords is broadly seen by the public as doing an acceptable job?
It depends. Some opinion polls say it is and some say it isn't. I think people like the House of Lords when it agrees with them and they don't like it when it disagrees. It can suddenly find itself the most heroic institution in the country, and sometimes usually it's the most ignored and sometimes it's the most reviled. I think the Lords' role, or the important role of the Lords, is to scrutinise government, to improve or suggest improvements to legislation, and therefore make law better for the public, because everything we do collectively as parliamentarians affects people in the streets. So the Lords looks at every dot and comma of legislation. That's a critical role. I think it should stick to that central role and not become a great political sounding chamber. I think there's another democratic house in Parliament for that.
We heard evidence in the previous session. I think you were here for much of it. One of the points that came out in respect of the role of the House of Lords and the government's attitude to it was that perhaps it was seen, on the one hand, ministers in the House of Lords tended to view it and behaved as if it was a revising chamber and being very deliberative, but that at some points in exchanges with the government as the executive, it was tended to be seen as an inconvenience. And you've kind of alluded to that in your opening comments, where you see the two distinct roles. Well, perhaps distinct is not the right word, but there's two complementary but perhaps competitive roles in terms of being leader of the House of Lords and the Conservative leader in the House of Lords.
Well, I think there is an institutional conflict. I think members of any government, and I've been in the House of Lords running the opposition office for a long time under a Labour government, and I've been there under a Conservative government, and members of government in the House of Commons are always very impatient to get things done. And there's the famous old thing when the American Constitution was formed, when I think it was Jefferson asked Washington why you're creating a Senate, and he poured a cup of tea into a saucer and he said it's to cool it. So the House of Lords does have a cooling function on hasty things. It takes time. Yes, the executive gets impatient. It takes weeks and months to get legislation sometimes through the House of Lords. I get people knocking on my door, colleagues, and my predecessors in Labour government have the other way, have done also. But I think that is a good thing, because no government should have a majority in the House of Lords, and that requires discussion and negotiation and listening. It is a frustrating process sometimes for the executive, but the executive's not there to be pleased in everything. The executive's there to be tested and challenged. That's what we're all here for as parliamentarians.
I mean, in that sense, we're talking about good laws, aren't we? So
yes.
Do you find that you have to be robust in defence of the rights and privileges of the House of Lords in your dealings with ministers?
I wouldn't put it that way. I've heard people in the past say that something should be done to the House of Lords, but I've never found that problem of executive tolerance away with this chamber. I mean, the House of Commons could do that. It did it in 1649, but time is something they do get frustrated about, of course. But we have conventions in the House. We have kept freer procedures in the House of Lords than the House of Commons now have. And I, as leader, and I think this government position is exactly the same, we're absolutely congruent on this. The preservation of the free procedures of the House of Lords, which include taking a reasonable amount of time to discuss legislation, is something to which we attach great importance, because it's the best way, or a very good way, of achieving bad and hasty law.
Thank you. Tom MacDonald.
There's quite a growing consensus about a bicameral process structure, but is it appropriate that the second chamber is unelected and plays the role that it does in the legislative process?
Well, that's a matter for a decision and discussion by the political parties collectively, and that the House of Commons is engaged in that. I mean, you were asking earlier what's the justification that hereditary peers are in the House of Lords at the moment. The justification is that the House of Commons and the House of Lords assented to the 1999 Act, which put them there. And I rather suspect, John, you probably voted for the third reading of that. In principle, if we were creating...
An accusation.
in principle, I now allow myself a personal view, since I've given one. I'll give you this one, John. It won't necessarily please all my colleagues. Of course, if you were coming down from Mars and creating a new parliament, you would, in my judgment, and I've said this in the chamber over many years, in my judgment the people should elect their members. But this is not the place where we find ourselves. We find ourselves in a parliamentary system which operates well, in my judgment, and any next step should be considered carefully and considered collectively.
Your view is elect a chamber?
That is a personal view that I've expressed, yes. It's not the view of the government.
No, see, there's growing consensus.
Yeah.
David Jones.
Lord True, you mentioned your dual role. You're leader of the Lords. You're also a cabinet minister, member of the government. You've therefore got probably a unique perspective. How would you say the government views the relationship between the Lords and the Commons?
I think broadly, I mean, there are niggles, as I was indicating in reply to the chair. But I think that the government most of my colleagues would see it as a very productive relationship. And I think the kind of engagement that takes place on legislation in the House of Lords is something which, at the most senior level, my colleagues do value and do take very seriously. And although the nominal number of defeats on bills may be limited, they're rather too high for my taste, since my job's to get the stuff through, a lot of amendments are made, and they're made by consent as a result of discussion, very often, obviously, building on issues that have arisen in your House, and the House of Lords has more time to get the precise word and details right. I think overall, though, the government would consider it a very constructive relationship.
Wouldn't agree that there's a significant tension between the two houses, which may have increased considerably over recent years?
Well, that's a slightly different question. There are aspects of conflict. And I do think that the House of Lords, and this would be gentle advice I'd give to it as leader, as well as rather more firm advice I'd give to it as leader of the Conservative Party, is I think the House of Lords, and particularly the unelected, if you like, people who've they're all unelected, but I mean the people who are not represented any political party. I think you have to be very careful how far you take challenge to the House of Commons, however controversial the legislation. And I did say in the last night of the Rwanda bill that I did think that, particularly in the case of crossbenchers, if I may say so, taking things 3 or 4 times back to the House of Commons after the elected House has made itself clear is not a place that's wise in the long term for an unelected House to go. And I note that, in the ping-pong stage of the Rwanda bill, for example, 11 crossbench peers who had taken no part at all in the passage of the bill, hadn't spoken or hadn't voted, came down and voted against what the House of Commons had sent back to the House of Lords. Now, that's slightly difficult territory, and I'm not making that charge particularly against crossbenchers. I believe that we need to reassert, re-agree, and re-understand the conventions that apply between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the fundamental convention is that the government of the day, with a mandate, gets the King's business in reasonable time. So there are points of conflict, and have been under successive governments, which break out. And it is certainly true that the House of Lords has become more ready to go into ping-pong, both quantitatively, the number of times, and in length, the length of ping-pong, 3-4 iterations, than was the case 10 or 15 years ago.
And what would you say is the cause of that?
What would I say was the cause of that? It's hard to say. Of course, my opponents would say this was uniquely terrible government legislation. I would say it was a sort of a failure to understand the wisdom of that legislation. I think that in a strange sort of way, and I don't like to say harsh things about the House of Lords, I think that the House of Lords has become more confident, which is a good thing in many ways. But it's and it is the old, which I remember when I first went there, and I don't want to worry John by saying I want to hark back to that, but the hereditary dominated house knew its limits, and apart from the famous case in the early 90s, generally they would fold their cards. I think the more, and this was something that was discussed at the time after the reforms of 1999, which I remember very well, the House of Lords feeling more confident in itself and feeling a little bit more pleased with itself sometimes, I think has become slightly more assertive. And what has become much more assertive definitely is the crossbench element. And again, against the government, since 2017, the crossbenchers have cast 73% of 25,000 votes. They've cast 73% against the government. Well, that is a shift. And there are reasons for that, but it's a fact that that's an element of it.
I think you were here when the previous panel discussed the detailed scrutiny that the House of Lords applies to legislation. Would you say that the government has become overly reliant on the Lords to carry out that sort of scrutiny?
Well, that's a very difficult thing. I mean, I did come in just at that point. Sorry I arrived early. I didn't want to inhibit anything. I wasn't quite sure what the timing was. I think Lord Kinnoull said rather very tactfully that he didn't want to imply any defect in the House of Commons, and that is an absolutely fundamental principle that should be observed. But put it this way, if you're radically the House of Lords ceased to exist tomorrow, the House of Commons would have to find a mechanism better than now exists to do the role of scrutiny. It wouldn't necessarily be the House of Lords as it currently exists. But I think there is an expectation, we'll clear that up in the second House. I think there is and it's happened under successive governments, there is a kind of lazy habit that happens, which I don't think is a good habit, as a matter of fact, that things are added on to legislation in the second House, which, the House of Commons only gets to see when they get back there. The House of Lords has certainly become convenient. But I don't want to impute any fault to the House of Commons in saying that.
So just to repeat the question, I'm inferring from what you're saying that you do think that the government has become overly reliant upon the Lords to carry out that scrutiny?
No, I think that the lawmaking system places a great strain on the technical and time expertise of the House of Lords. And that's not just government as the executive. I think the system as a whole has come to depend tremendously on the very important revising role of the Lords, which it adopted by accident after stupidly challenging the House of Commons over the budget in Edwardian times.
Thank you.
Well, do you want to come in? Well,
so, Lord Trin, you said that we should reassert the precedents that existed and the understanding of the primacy of the House of Commons, etc. And you use Rwanda as the example. I just wanted to be clear, what precedent do you think was existing that would have meant the Lords wouldn't have ping-ponged that?
Well, practice. I mean, I think that the Lords is a house of convention.
So what convention existed that a non-manifesto pledge, in fact, it goes against the manifesto of the Conservative Party, because the manifesto of the Conservative Party said that they would continue to welcome asylum seekers in and they would make sure that they could be returned to their home countries when it was safe to do so, but said nothing about exporting people to other countries. So it goes against the manifesto pledge. How is it against convention that the House of Lords should hold out to the nth degree on an issue that the government is breaking its own manifesto on?
Well, that's a slightly loaded way of putting it, if I may say so politely.
You use that example. I mean, if you use a different example, I wouldn't be so loaded, maybe.
No, I used an example of something being sent back to the House of Commons 3 to 4 times. I happened to choose the Rwanda bill. It's not the only one. You are absolutely right. If I may, could I complete the answer, if I may? You're right to say that there isn't any sort of convention which says, on paper, which says that the House of Lords shouldn't send something back more than once. The question is custom and practice over time. Custom and practice over time flows from the respect and understanding between the two houses. It also fundamentally, and this is the most important thing in the House of Lords, actually, in terms of making the House of Lords function, is the understanding which was exemplified in the original Salisbury-Addison Convention, which came into being at the time when Labour was outnumbered 10 to 1, and the purpose was to allow the Attlee government to enable radical social change without challenge from the House of Lords. That is certainly a convention which was re-examined by the Cunningham Committee in 2006.
Not a convention that was really held on in the last Labour government. I mean, the banning of fox hunting was in Labour's policy position since 1910, but it was required to use the Parliament Act to force that through. The equalisation of homosexuality was in Labour's policies positions for 25 years, but it still required the Parliament Act to use it through. When Labour's in, it seems to be fine for the Lords to fetter the will of government, but suddenly Conservatives complain when even a meeker version of the Lords do their job. Does that not seem slightly hypocritical?
No, I don't think it seems hypocritical at all, and you misinterpret if you think that this should only apply to a Conservative government. I was respectfully submitting to the committee that it would be to the benefit of the House of Commons and the House of Lords if we reassessed, I didn't say reassess the conventions, and I think that's some of the useful work that your committee may be looking at. The conventions, how they operate.
Perhaps put Lloyd's question slightly differently. I mean, we have seen over this period, the period that you've been in the House of Lords, actually, an increasing amount of timetabling in the Commons, and I just wonder whether the less deliberation that's taking place on the floor in the House of Commons, and because of whipped committees where not all MPs are paying attention or scrutinising, has that led to a greater burden on the House of Lords in terms of deliberation, and is that leading to more ping-pong between the Commons, i.e. is the fault with the Commons more than the Lords?
Well, that may be so, but I'm not going to comment on that in a quick way. There is certainly a burden on the House of Lords. I think the two things are related, but there is a distinction. I think that it's very important that the government shouldn't override the protection of time, for example, which is only a convention, the usual intervals in the House of Lords, that time is given for the opposition and all parties to assess legislation before each stage. And my submission is that if we had a look at where we are on conventions overall, we could get an understanding between the two houses, which would also be an understanding between the main opposition party and the main government party. Because the fundamental position, the way the House of Lords operates, has nothing to do with numbers, which has been a lot of discussion about. It's actually the convention between the two major parties that the King's government generally is allowed to be carried on. And, the hunting thing was for some people was a conscience issue, but I don't really want to go back on that. I hear it's coming their way again, potentially, if you manage to persuade the electors of your merits. Yeah.
Ronnie?
I'll show you, just to repeat some of the previous questions. Okay, the number of House of Lords, our predecessor committee, Burns Committee, the man in the street is saying the numbers are huge. 600 has been mooted. Does the government agree with that?
The government doesn't agree with that, no. The government doesn't accept the limit on the size of the House. And I think there are difficulties with a limit. The first and obvious limit is that if you have an appointed House, which is, I think, a subject which in the future would have to be debated, though is not on the floor at the moment, if you have a limit on the size of the House, obviously the House can't be coerced except through the Parliament Act, which is a great blunderbuss instrument. So, as Lord Kinnoull was saying, you would have to always have the safeguard of being able to increase the numbers over a limit. That was done in the early 18th century to get the Treaty of Utrecht through. It was threatened on various occasions on the House of Commons, but on the House of Lords by the House of Commons to get various pieces of legislation through. So far as the numbers are concerned, I don't obsess over the numbers. I do think we need to think about the balance. I don't think the balance at the moment in the House is right, and I've said that on the floor, so I'm not saying anything that my colleagues in government would be surprised to hear. But the reality is that since the 1999 reform, there's only ever been one vote, or two votes, I think, in the House of Lords where over 600 have voted. We've just discussed the Rwanda bill, in this. The number voting, we didn't get above 500 voting in this most debated piece of legislation. You never need sharp elbows and to get into a seat in the House of Lords. So I actually don't think
that not the very argument for reducing the number in the first place. If there's 200 who can't even turn out for something like the Rwanda vote, then what are those 200 doing?
Well, so they have other roles that they fulfil. They may not be interested in that piece of legislation. The House of Lords is they don't like being described as it, because many of them are not. They work full-time and more than full-time, but it is not a professional political house. And there are people who take interest in certain pieces of legislation and not in others. If it is not going to be a professional political house, and that would very much change the character of the House. There are people who say it should be more like the House of Commons. People should give an undertaking to be there every day. One, it become more expensive. Two, it become more like the House of Commons. The House of Lords, if it has any merit, is that it should be different from the House of Commons, that it should be in different perspectives and different approaches. And if it is not a full-time house of professional politicians, it has to be larger than the House of Commons in order to find the people to fulfil the roles. I kid you not, it's actually quite difficult to stop committees, where some parties find it in the House of Lords at the moment.
You don't consider any cap at all? We're looking at, I'll preempt Lloyd here to say, we're looking at a Labour government coming in. There's a potential there they can load more Labour peers in there. So any number. It's the fact that there's no cap there whatsoever.
Well, the House of Lords is smaller than it was when the Burns Committee reported. Actually, as a matter of fact, it was 823 when Burns reported, and it's fewer now. It has an average age of 71, as we've heard, which imposes a natural cap. You're looking at the average age, but we tend to die out. The formal cap, the problem with the formal cap is that if the House of Lords suddenly turns rogue and says we're going to stop the House of Lords Commons doing something, you might not think that such a constitutional crisis would arise, but we've seen some funny things in recent years. It's not a good place to go. Before 1999, there were well over 1,000 members of the House of Lords, but the effective number was much fewer. I think we should obsess a little bit less about the nominal numbers and concentrate a little bit more on the real numbers. And the real numbers are the average number voting in 2023 was 353 in divisions. By the way, I'd love to see some SNP peers in the House. We're waiting for them. We're waiting for them.
Well then, stop complaining, Ronnie.
No. You don't join something you don't agree with.
Yeah. Well, I recognise Scotland's Parliament was always unicameral, but we'd love to see some of you guys.
Well, that's because the committee system works differently in the Scottish Parliament. So from what I'm taking from your answer there, is there's no chance of the Conservative government or the Labour incoming government agreeing on some sort of capping system?
I think not a formal statutory cap for the reasons I've given. I think that...
what about allocating appointments then? Some sort of agreement about allocating appointments?
Well, allocating appointments, I think that there has to again be some understanding between the parties. I think that the Labour Party have a case at the moment which you've heard Angela put. I think that it is quite clear that the Labour Party has, we have, I think, 51 peers over 80, believe it or not. The Labour Party, I think, have 56 peers over 80. And it is clear that there needs to be a restocking, and I think Angela's made that point perfectly fairly. But overall, as I say, the numbers since the Burns Committee, despite the apparent increases, the House is actually smaller. What has happened is there are a lot more Conservatives. Now, obviously, that's a point on which you can have very legitimate debate.
It looks like we have a division.
Ah, right. Just starting?
Just starting, yeah.
8 minutes. Do you want me to go now and come back?
Yeah, if that's okay.
Whatever suits you, Chair.
We'll adjourn for 15 minutes. And
right.
Then,
Well,
resume
it may not
questioning.
look like it, but I can get there and back quite quickly.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently...
I think we were still on Ronnie's questions.
I think we just finished that, did we not? I think we'd completed that.
Oh, we come to an end. Excellent. In that case, Damien Moore, the floor
Thank
is
you,
yours.
Chairman. Lord True, would you be in favour of a mandatory retirement age for members of the House of Lords?
It's a very difficult one. I mean, if people are really obsessing about numbers, which I've indicated I don't, then clearly it would be a very quick, easy, swift piece of legislation to impose a retirement age, because I think there's somewhere in about 130 odd people over 80, for example. I think that would be rough, but and I say I don't obsess about the numbers. I think the problems with a retirement age are, as others have said, that some people are ready. Some people make an enormous contribution to the House. I mean, Angela, I think, mentioned Alf Dubbs, who, of course, is an amazing active member. I remember James Mackay on our benches, hugely respected into his 90s. It's not always the case. So it was something that would need to be thought about very carefully. The House of Commons doesn't have such a rule. But clearly, if you're in emergency action, you wanted to reduce the numbers, it's something you could do. Personally, I wouldn't be in a hurry to go there, but it would have to be thrown in if there were a general debate about what the House of Lords really should be like, rather than a bit of ad hoc action, then clearly it would have to be something that could be discussed.
I mean, because the other thing, as well as absolute numbers, is effectiveness and participation, and of which it's not based on age, is it? There might be quite a substantial group of peers from across the House of Lords that are very active into older age, whereas some are not quite as old or quite as much life experience as they have, don't turn up as much, don't participate as much, and are not part of the processes they maybe should be.
That's true. Again, I think it's a nature of this very weird. I mean, let's face it, the House of Lords is a very unusual survival, which most people judge to be a survival with some great continuing use. I mean, participation obviously does vary enormously, but there are people. I was in the House yesterday, and there's a former president of the Royal Society who came down and, asked a question, and he's not there every day, but I wouldn't expect him to be, So I think it's difficult. It's not like being in a whips. Well, it is. We're in the whips office. Of course, we count the numbers of our Conservative peers, and we do want them to be there. But overall, it's slightly different from the House of Commons in that respect. And I think we would go down a dangerous alley if we said that those who don't turn up very much don't necessarily contribute. I think you need to look very carefully at the quality-quantity quotient again.
And then what about the idea of setting a term limit for members of the House of Lords? How do you feel about that?
Well, again, I think it's equally it's a thing that obviously Burns Committee did talk about. Again, it raises the question of what is it, how long should it be, and how does that position yourself in a career, particularly those who are political members of the House. I mean, it'll always probably be the way of things if you have an appointments commission. They tend to look at appointing more experienced people than, taking a chance on a 200 to 1 outsider who's 23 years old. But if you had 15 years in political thing, is it a place where after you've been a SPAD, you go and do a spell in the House of Lords and then you aspire to be in the House of Commons when you're 40? Or is it something which, and therefore you reduce the House of Lords, if you like, to being a kind of ante-room? Or is it something that you don't want to go to until you're sure of your retirement path and you don't go there until you're 55 or whatever? And I think there may be unintended consequences that one would have to think through. And it's certainly the case. Well, I'd be out next year for a 15-minute limit. Well, my wife would be quite pleased about that. She might see a bit more of me. It just have to be thought through. So it's an idea on the table, but all these ideas It's one of the fundamental reasons why the government says that, you shouldn't do things piecemeal. You have to look at what sort of House of Lords we want to have. If the country in the 21st century wants to persist with an all-appointed House of Lords made up of people who are known by successive Prime Ministers and the unknown people who sit on the House of Lords Appointments Commission, then all well and good. But we should probably, if that is the way we want to go forward, if that in the 1999 parlance is the actual stage 2, then obviously I think some of these various ideas that you're throwing about would have to be put on the table and considered.
Because we heard before about the 15 years, and it was suggested that you could add extra time and add an extra 10 or whatever. But it would be sort of making that equal to everyone, wouldn't it, which causes the problem, and those that come in and contribute and do all the right things would be perhaps unfairly thrown out at the same time as someone who's never turned up.
Well, it's the old who decides thing, isn't it? I mean, I don't want to upset members of the Garrick Club, which I've virtually never been to, but I mean, who decides who are going to be those elect who stay on after 15 years? So it's an idea. I personally think it would be very difficult to implement and might have unintended consequences. But if Parliament in the future decided that we want to deposit for the next century the second chamber as an appointed house, then clearly some of those things would have to be looked at.
Lloyd. Thank you. Evidence received in this inquiry indicates there's pretty widespread support, including in the Lords itself, to abolish the elections of the hereditary peers. So I'm not necessarily saying at this point abolish the hereditary peers who are in situ, although that might be a personal preference, but the widespread support seems to be coming from people who are saying that we should just not have these by-elections anymore. Why is the government dragging its heels on this?
Well, because once you abolish the by-elections, whether you leave the deposit of hereditary peers there, which would cause obviously far less turbulence in the House, you would throw out an enormous amount of experience if you threw out all hereditary peers, former leaders, this guy who's just been in. But I'm coming back to that. The effect of doing that is in the long term, as when we abolished the membership of the Irish peerage in the House of Lords in 1922. The last member, Lord Kilmorey, died in 1961, so it slowly went away. But the ineluctable result of stopping the by-elections is that the hereditary peerage, whose average age now is just under 70, would die out, and you would be left with an all-appointed house by accident. And the rationale for what happened in 1999, which I was intimately involved with, which Derry Irvine described at the time as a compromise which didn't please everybody, the rationale was that leaving the hereditary peers there would be something the Labour Party over time wouldn't be able to endure forever, and there would have to be an agreement on what stage 2 would be. No one actually envisaged in 1999 that hereditary peers would be there after 2005. And if you ask most hereditary peers, they wouldn't be fighting to stay forever. But it does pose the question of what follows, and what follows in terms of a House of Parliament with enormous power in our Constitution should be something which is decided. So that is the reason why the government has held to the deal. The understanding that was made was that the 92 should stay there until such time as the two Houses of Parliament agreed on a permanent stage 2 reform of the House. That hasn't happened yet.
The reason is that they're an irritant to cause further reform.
Well, that's what the sand in the shoe, as Lord Salisbury said at the time, yes.
But surely, if there is widespread agreement that the next step in our constitutional settlement in this country has never been of large revolution, it's always been of incremental change. If there is no agreement, clearly, of incremental change, to get rid of this particular irritant. There are still other irritants, the Lord's spiritual, etc., existing. Why can't the government do something that the majority of the House of Lords wants?
Well, I'd say two things. Firstly, a lot is made of this motion. When 191 people voted, I was present. There was a nemine dissentientia. It was a take-note motion. They tell you it was unanimously agreed. It wasn't unanimously agreed. There was just no vote was forced. But we allow that fiction to continue, and it is certainly true that the majority of the House of Lords has found it a convenience for various reasons. If the by-elections didn't continue, whether they find it an embarrassment or whether they find it...
Apart from the government wanting it to be an irritant for future Labour governments, why on earth wouldn't this government want to have the final settlement of no hereditary peers but a appointed House?
Well, because this government has believed, governments over successive governments, we had the attempt with the Wakeham Commission, we had the attempt with the coalition to actually create a reform House of Lords. The government's view is that there shouldn't be piecemeal reform, that we should arrive at a certain point at an agreed end result. If you're advocating from the point of view of the Labour Party that the end result in the 21st century is permanently an appointed House, then fine. But advocate that. Don't say, let's get rid of these by-elections and get the appointed House by stealth.
I'm advocating a very British approach, which is incremental change that might lead to abolition, might not lead to abolition, might lead to continuation, might not, but we take each step at a time. And it seems to me that the Conservative Party seem to be taking a very un-British approach, that they want everything or not. We have the Lord's spiritual, and we've heard from a number of witnesses that there might even be an agreement from the Lord's spiritual themselves that they could reduce. They very rarely attend in the whole numbers anyway, that they could reduce their numbers. Would the government consider taking action on that to reduce or to remove the Lord's spiritual?
No, that isn't the government's position. As I said,
even if the Lord's spiritual themselves would like it?
I've sought to explain that the government thinks that there should be, at some point, the overall consideration, not incremental reform. So far as the presence of the bishops is concerned, I mean, that does have implications for the role of the church in society as a whole. So it's not, the government is not advocating change there at the moment. If in a spirit of inquiry, since I'm trying to help this committee in its spirit of inquiry, it is certainly the case that when the Conservative Party in a previous avatar advocated an elected Senate in 2000, 80-20 Senate with representatives from the regions, at that time members of the church came forward and said privately they would be ready to see their numbers reduced. But that's a historic comment. What is the position in 2024 would be entirely a matter for the church, and it's not somewhere where the government's planning to go.
Just following up on that, I mean, deciding to go to a wholly appointed chamber is actually quite a big constitutional change, in fairness. So I can understand why, we're still hobbling on with the system of hereditaries. But just to turn that on its head, I mean, the discussion we had in the previous session where, the idea of having a part elected, part appointed, or a wholly elected second chamber, that raises with it questions about challenge to primacy of the House of Commons if it's overly elected. To what extent have these questions been considered since the last time we looked at that under the coalition?
Well, I think there's been no appetite to look at that, frankly, in recent years. I think it was clear that, most major attempts to reform my house have perished in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
Because the House of Commons, uniquely among chambers in bicameral parliaments across the world, doesn't seem to be very willing to tolerate the prospect of an elected chamber down the corridor. And obviously, having failed in the coalition years to make progress with the legislation for the difficulties with timetabling that arose in the Commons, I don't think there's been an appetite to go back there. But at some point, if someone said, well, we have to actually, try again what was tried with the Wakeham Commission, what was tried in 2010, if someone said in 2020, 2027, 2028, whenever it might be, we've got to have a look at this overall, then clearly one could go through those hoops all over again. But I think that's not somewhere the government has sought to go. Of course, the government was scarred by having tried to introduce what they thought was a reform which had relatively wide consent. And I think that, back to your original question, spending hours and hours and hours of legislative time in trying to get through a major reform is not something that many governments find congenial.
No, indeed. Tom Randall.
Thank you, Chair. Lord True, when we had the first panel up, I put it to them that the Prime Minister has substantial powers over the appointment process, both in terms of the number of peers created and the candidates nominated. And I think Lord Kinnoull noted that there is no other Western democracy where the head of government has such wide power in terms of appointing members of the legislature. Do you think it's appropriate for such power to rest with the Prime Minister?
Well, effectively it's a prerogative power, isn't it? I mean, I think comparing with other legislatures in a sense a slightly false comparison, because there's no other legislature like this. If you have appointments and someone says, well, True, you can go to the House of Lords, someone should be accountable. And the great way we have of achieving accountability in our democratic system is in this great immortal House of Commons, where the public send their representatives here and the Prime Minister is responsible to it. A very public figure. And Prime Ministers have damaged their reputation by misuse of patronage. The example of Lloyd George used to always be quoted. There have been more recent Prime Ministers of different parties who get criticised for it, but it is in the open. And the constitutionally correct principle, it must be, in my submission and the government's submission, that the monarch's principal advisor must be the person who advises the monarch, who is the fount of all honour under our system, who to appoint to a House of Parliament. The Prime Minister is the King's principal advisor, is the fulcrum point of that, and actually the point of accountability.
There is a House of Lords Appointments Commission, but there are different appointments process for the non-party political peers nominated by HOC than for peers appointed by party leaders. Is it right that there's such a distinction?
Well, I think the creation of HOC was an attempt to bring in some obviously deliberative, independent role into the appointing of some, though not all crossbenchers. I mean, there are still crossbenchers who are appointed on prime ministerial advice only. And I think HOC in general does its work extremely well. The problem with some of the propositions for a statutory HOC, with perhaps broader powers, indeed intruding beyond propriety into political appointments, is back to the problem of accountability and transparency. I mean, one of the criticisms of prime ministerial exercise of patronage is it's not transparent enough. Well, obviously the HOC process isn't very transparent either. And I did make a rather impish speech in the Lords a few months ago where I said, at least pointing to people who were saying they wanted the statutory, which is something we would have to consider, but I don't favour it myself, and the government doesn't believe that's the right path. At least you could know who Rishi Sunak is, but name me one of the members of the Appointments Commission. I could do it, but could the person in the dog and duck do that? Yet they're the people who are appointing people who can make their laws and change their lives. I think it works well. I think it was regrettable the government took as much time as it did to replace an independent member, and I would apologise for that. And I think we're recruiting 2 more. And I think that the role of HOLAC's an important one, and we should support it.
So my next question was going to be whether the government has confidence in HOLAC carrying out its role. So I presume from that answer that's...
I think we are, yes. Generally, we are, yes.
And on overall reform, the final question from me is that HOLAC's recently announced that it will be asking political parties to provide additional information and assurances about its nominees to the House of Lords before carrying out vetting. Is the government happy to comply with those changes?
Well, in a sense, it's a matter for HOLAC to ask for the information it wants. I mean, there are, I think, issues about information that can be made available to HOLAC, which have caused some issues in the past relating to data protection and so on. That's not in relation to what might be said by political parties. I think it is reasonable. I may be annoying the chairman of the Conservative Party and whoever the counterpart in the Labour Party is. I mean, it's reasonable that HOLAC should seek information about individuals. I don't think that they have a role in relation to propriety, and if they think there is any issue of propriety, we should potentially assist them. Yes, but that's a personal view. It may be if you had the chief executives of various parties, they would say that the leader of the House of Lords misspoke. I would be advised on the matter.
I mean, just continuing on HOLAC. I mean, we know that, as you've explained, the Prime Minister ultimately is the person who submits the names to the monarch, and then the peerages are approved or not. We know that HOLAC have advised on the resignation honours of the 2 previous Prime Ministers and the conclusions they drew. One of in a previous hearing we had with HOLAC, there was some discussion about those recommendations that hadn't been followed, or well, one particular one. And there was some discussion about whether HOLAC would be free to give proper advice to the Prime Minister if there was a presumption it wouldn't be approved. And certainly another nominee may have been subject to that. I mean, what do you think? I mean, there's a theory, there's nothing actually in statutes that obliges a Prime Minister to. Clearly it's transparent when the Prime Minister hasn't accepted those nominations, and then the public can form a judgment. Do you think that's enough?
I think it's certainly important, and obviously, let's name names. I mean, a lot of people keep going on about my noble friend Lord Cruddas, who's the case in point. And he takes a lot of incoming, and he's not necessarily popular with people around the show because he's quite active as tweeter and so on and so forth. He's actually a very active and supportive member of the House of Lords. I mean, in that particular case, the then Prime Minister took a view. The government was transparent, as you say, Chair, at the time, and it published the Prime Minister's letter to the HOLAC Chair. I think it would be these would be rare occasions. Any Prime Minister should consider HOLAC advice very carefully. But ultimately, repeating what I said, it is the Prime Minister who is democratically accountable. And turning it on its head, if we've heard about the Labour Party would wish to restock its benches, say there were a change of government, which of course I don't anticipate, and I'm fighting night and day to prevent. But the Labour Prime Minister said, we've got to have these X number of people, and then HOLAC said, well, you can't have A, B, and C. This is a very difficult place to go to, because who are they accountable when the new Prime Minister's just been elected by the British people? So they can give the advice, but I think that you should have that relatively transparent dialogue, but ultimately you should stay with the Prime Minister.
Yeah. Okay. Does anyone have any final questions? No. Great. Well, thank you very much, Lord True. And if there's anything else you'd like to share with us on reflection, please do put it in writing.
Well, I've probably said far too much, and I'll be told off by my
witness for us.
It's a really, really important question, the balance between the houses. The only thing I would say, finally, is just before when I was interrupted and went off, the conventions are, to my submission, more important in a way than numbers. And there is a very great convention, which is the respect and understanding between the two political parties who can propose and block. That's the main opposition party, whoever it is, and the main government party. And we've had huge numbers in the House of Lords, but we've lost 73% of the divisions in this session. And we stopped losing them when the Labour Party decided it was probably time to let the legislation go through. And it's ultimately on that conventional understanding that the House must operate. But anyway, that may seem odd to you. We're a funny old lot. And thank you. It's a great honour. It's a great honour to be down in the Democratic House. I've fought enough elections to know how tough it is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Order. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.